With the COP26 freshly in our minds, we turn our attention to looking at the impacts of climate change on the use of veterinary medicines and their likely increase in use and the consequences for the environment. Predicting how future climate change will influence the spread of animal diseases is very complex. There's an interplay between the climate, between nature, humans and wildlife. The IPCC has stated that human activity has already resulted in a 1-degree warming above pre-industrial levels, and we are quite confident that as warming continues at the current rate, we will reach 1.5 degrees centigrade between 2030 and 2052, likely to result in extreme weather such as more frequent droughts, flooding, heat waves, rapid changes in temperature, rainfall and humidity, which will affect the world's ecosystems and consequently the opportunity for disease. The consequences of climate change on livestock disease are significant. The incidence of vector-borne animal diseases is likely to increase, with the emergence and re-emergence of a range of infectious, mostly zoonotic diseases throughout the world. Livestock are extremely important to rural livelihoods. In 2013, there were an estimated 38 billion livestock in the world, or nearly 5 animals for every person. In the developing countries, around 1 billion poor farmers keep livestock, and the burden of animal disease in developing countries is high, disease accounting for 20% of ruminants and more than 50% of poultry mortalities each year, causing a loss of approximately $300 billion. Climate change will increase these losses, as 65 animal diseases have been identified as the most important to developing countries, and over half of these are climate sensitive. This slide really attempts to show the 7 drivers of zoonotic disease, looking at their complexities, their interconnectivities, the dependencies, the interdependencies. You can see that it's a very busy slide and lots of linkages, but all of these aspects come together to provide the opportunity for zoonotic disease transmission. This slide shows the impacts of climate change on livestock. The changes in temperature, the increase in temperature, the increase of carbon dioxide, the variation in precipitation, all have an impact on the quality of the forage, which obviously has an impact on the overarching health of the livestock. Changes in reproduction, changes in quality of production, decrease in milk production, for example, the change overarchingly in the forage quality, but also the availability and consumption of water will also have a massive impact on livestock in the future. So in the previous slide, we looked at the impacts of climate change on livestock. This slide shows the reverse of that, and it actually shows the impact of livestock on climate change. So we know that, for example, feed production has an impact on nitrogen and more increase of nitrogen into the atmosphere. The same with processing and transport of animal feeds and food production, distribution, fertilizer applications to grow all those actually increases carbon dioxide. And then of course we have manure management and animal production and fermentation, which results in increases in methane, all of which contribute to driving climate change. The WHO have also stated that climate change is anticipated to have a significant impact on the occurrence of infectious diseases in both animals and human populations. And that's brought about by the influence and the spread of virus and bacterial diseases through insect hosts, animal hosts, and human behaviour. And we're going to have a look at each of these in turn now. In addition to increases in temperature, we're likely to see a change in rainfall patterns and precipitation, and experts predict that rainfall will increase in some regions and reduce in others. Increased precipitation means that there will be more open, still areas of water, more puddles, which are perfect for the larval stages of insects to grow in. And according again to the WHO, wet, humid conditions have caused past disease outbreaks. In some places, droughts could also increase opportunities for vectors to breed as riverbeds dry up and leave stagnant pools behind. Linked to the insect vectors, birds are often also a primary host, and their higher concentrations at shrinking waterholes may enhance insect interactions between insects and birds, and therefore creating this opportunity for wider dissemination. Habitat change as a consequence of climate change will likely lead to greater contact between domestic animals, wild animals, and humans as a consequence of a reduced habitat availability due to flooding, for example, or changes in the proximity to which wildlife are exposed to domesticated animals. Changes in rainfall and temperature will affect the availability of food and therefore might dictate more encroachment across different species and greater contact with wildlife and humans. And of course, flooding as a consequence of climate change will create the opportunity for sewage to mix with waters, human sewage and land, etc., but also animal manures all mixing together, potentially creating the opportunity for viruses to spread through an entirely different route. Human behaviour also changes as a consequence of climate change. The CDC has estimated that 3 out of 4 diseases will come from animals in the future, driven by activities that bring greater proximity of wild animals, domestic animals and people, increasing the opportunity for transmission of disease between the different vectors. The destruction of forest ecosystems has increased the risk that viruses can leap from wild animals to domestic animals or directly to people. Degraded habitats have been shown to harbour more viruses, which create the opportunity for greater infection in humans and animals. The recent publication in Nature has shown that biodiversity loss amplifies viral infections in the remaining species, creating greater opportunity for onward transmission to other species. And now we're just going to look at the environmental consequences of veterinary medicines under changing climate and what it really means in terms of use or frequency of use. If we consider the routes of entry of veterinary medicines into the environment from animals that have been treated, then we have excretion of dung directly onto the surface of the soil or directly into surface waters. We have spreading of manure from treated animals on arable land. We have the direct and indirect entry into surface waters or sediments in aquaculture following treatment. And then, of course, we have spillages at external application sites or where there's preparation of materials and direct exposure outdoors. And all of these are in contrast to the principal routes of pharmaceuticals from human use, where the main entry is via the wastewater treatment works or sewage treatment plants into surface waters. And perhaps another interesting consideration in terms of climate change is the contribution made for the production of our pet foods, our companion animal foods, our pet dog food, for example, and how that actual processing and development contributes to carbon emissions in terms of contributing again to climate change going forward. So there's a nice study here that looks at the environmental impacts of the pet food production and manufacture using a life cycle analysis case study, but again, perhaps something we haven't considered in terms of the contribution of our animals to climate change overall. So when we think about climate change and the opportunity that it presents to drive diseases, and particularly in developing countries, and the uncertainties around what will happen as a consequence of a warming planet, we anticipate the occurrence of more diseases, more zoonotic diseases, the likelihood of transmission being more frequent, the occurrence of vectors being more predominant as well. So we are anticipating, as a consequence of that, an increased use in veterinary medicines to tackle the ongoing threat from disease. And of course, with the increased use of veterinary medicines, we would anticipate a subsequent impact on the environment that is perhaps larger than that currently, which may, for example, lead to an increase in levels of residues in food or meat products, and of course, an increase of concentrations directly into the environment. We will also see changes in the receiving environment. So, for example, rivers will be either drier or wetter, so there may be more flooding, more opportunity to again spread for potential bacterial contamination or viruses through floodwaters. But the receiving environments are then going to be more prone to the residues that are occurring. And again, if you think about the dilution capacity of a river, if the river is drier, then there's less water to dilute the concentrations of the receiving pharmaceuticals from either human or veterinary pharmaceuticals. And perhaps the ecosystems themselves become less resilient to change as we become less and less volume in the rivers going forward. And of course, we have the combination of increased use of chemicals and veterinary medicines and human medicines coming together as a direct impact, as a consequence of more use, and as a consequence of changes to the receiving environment. So going forward, what do we need to do in response to an increasingly warming planet? Stephen et al. From 2019 in the Canadian Veterinary Journal suggested these 7 particular aspects, and I think they're still very current and very relevant, and I would like to reiterate them here. The key thing really going forward is to promote animal health and really remove that reliance on the need for veterinary pharmaceuticals in the first instance, linked together with improving the ecological and human health as part of a society-wide climate change plan. And therefore we need to really communicate the consequences, the implications of climate change for animal health, and how that then impacts on conservation, on sustainable food production systems, on food security, food biosecurity, public health, and community resilience. So some tasks to be done there around core messaging, for sure. And then, of course, there's this requirement of knowing to doing. So knowing about something and doing something about it are 2 completely different things. And so facilitating collaborative action, really developing that message into activities in the face of disagreements or institutional inertia. So awareness, communication, resulting ultimately in some form of activity and action. Strengthening the links between veterinary practices and veterinary practice alongside policy and research, certainly bringing on board social, ecological, economic and health sectors together as a community to build and understand the consequences of veterinary pharmaceuticals and climate change and animal disease going forward. Really making sure that the animal health knowledge is accessible to climate change planning decision makers. Often they are individuals or organisations that would not necessarily consider the consequences of veterinary pharmaceuticals. And really bringing climate change into the veterinary undergraduate and graduate curricula to really develop that thinking early on in the careers of future veterinarians and those involved in veterinary pharmaceuticals. And ultimately then expanding our thinking of animal health and climate change from moving away from simply risk management to also capacity building for healthy animal populations and animal health systems.